we have friends of ours, Mark and Susan, and they have been dreaming for this trip, especially Susan, about going to Hawaii. They've never been, and so they actually found time in their schedule. I think they're away for 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. And it was all they could talk about the last couple of weeks we were together, and whenever we met, how they were going. I think probably Susan started packing, in November of 2020, probably, for this trip. I mean, she was really all hyped, right? And so they fly out. It's a very long flight. I mean, it's like 14 hours or something. I mean, it's a bear. And go from here to California out to Hawaii. And, you just think about Hawaii. First of all, especially today here in the Northeast, it's 20-something degrees, and the wind chill factor probably has it in single digits, which is why I'm all dressed warm. It's freezing outside. And, you think about Hawaii, and you're thinking about sun, and you're thinking about nice beaches, and, you're thinking about, laying on the beach, and, trying to collect as many of those little umbrellas that come with the drinks, as you possibly can during a 10-day period, right? It's just what it is. So Mark sends me a picture of a sunset, and it's stunning. It's absolutely beautiful. And I text him back. I said, so how is it going? And he says, having a good time, spent the day yesterday hiking. And I was like, well, okay, but your definition of having a good time and mine are entirely different. I could not imagine flying all the way out there. And look, if you guys are watching now, really hope you're having a wonderful time. Really enjoy yourself. And if you enjoy hiking, knock yourself out. But in my mind, going all the way out there, would be really more about sitting, relaxing, and, wandering around a little bit, but really sort of settling in and enjoying. I mention this because, we have this gospel passage, which we've heard before, about Jesus being transfigured and Jesus with a couple of his disciples. Now, you have to understand, for the disciples and for Jesus to get around, they're basically on foot for everything. There's no Ubers, there's no train service, there's no buses. I mean, if you want to go from one place to another, you're basically walking all that distance. It intrigues me that only 3 disciples go with Jesus. See, because the way I vision this is that they have just got done walking all this distance to get to the bottom of this mountain. And mountains are a very prayerful place of solitude. And Jesus, we know, loves going up into the mountains to be alone to pray. I think Jesus probably said to the group, so any of you want to go with me? I'm going to go up the mountain and pray. And if you're wondering where the other 9 are, they're all laying down in some sort of shade, and sort of going, Lord, this is really nice. Great invitation. Thank you so much. I think I'm probably just going to hang out here. I'll wait for you to come back down, right? I want us to get this sense that there's this commonality now. There's this normalcy about being around Jesus. And so perhaps they don't feel all that they need to be with him every single minute of a day. And so, Peter, James, and John are the ones who, okay, let's go. Now, you got to remember, if this is a mountain, well, in order to get up the mountain means you're climbing the mountain. You are hoofing it all the way up as far as you can, or when Jesus says that he's had enough, to sit down. So you can imagine they get up there and that they're tired. How do we know that? Because Luke tells us that they fell asleep, that they got up there to pray. They got up there to pray, and they all doze off. They all doze off. So that the walk to the bottom of the mountain probably was enough for them to take a nap. But then hoofing up the mountain, being with Jesus, as much as they enjoyed being in Jesus' presence and they were glad to be there, they're very much just human beings, and they end up passing out and they're sleeping only to be awakened by this transfiguration. There's a couple of things I want to point out here that I think is really important. One is that Jesus is with them, and even if they're up there, going up there to pray, Jesus doesn't mind. Jesus is not offended. He doesn't go over and kick them and say, look, wake up, you came up here for a purpose. Purpose was that we would pray together. He leaves all that. Jesus is fine being with his disciples as they are. It's Jesus's presence that is really more important than any function or activity. Now, when they wake up, they see this transfiguration. The thing that's intriguing here is that Jesus and the disciples are a community. These three and Jesus form this community. The community goes up. Most of them fall asleep. Jesus is still at prayer. And yet in that relationship, it's not as though when they got there, anything spectacular happened being with Jesus or Jesus being with them. Any of you ever reflect upon this with your own prayer life? We want to be with Jesus, and because we're with Jesus, or at least we feel his presence, we know he's here, we're attuned to him. It doesn't mean that anything spectacular is always going to happen when we're with Jesus. Jesus is present to us. We're present to Jesus, and even when we nod off, Jesus is still present. Recognize that they wake up in the midst of this transfiguration that is happening, and it's not as though Jesus left them and went somewhere else. It's not as though Jesus said, well, you guys all fall asleep. I'm going to go over here. Jesus stayed with his community. And in the midst of that community, the transfiguration came about and was there. I think that is meant to be hopeful for us on this journey of Lent. We are trying to find ways, and sometimes we too have to climb mountains of our own making, a lot of times, to find the time to be with Jesus, to focus on his presence, and to focus on the fact that we're going to take this extra journey, these extra steps, despite how tired we are, because our intention is to be with Jesus. I want us to reflect upon the fact and realize that for Jesus, I think the fact that his disciples had this intention to be with him and to pray with him and to be awake, even though they all fell asleep. The fact that their intention was to be there was valuable to Jesus. It doesn't get him annoyed that they doze off. And I know I hear this a lot of time from folks who say, I try to pray and meditate and I always fall asleep. You know something? The fact that we are making the attempt to be with Jesus, and even though we may fall asleep, I'm not really sure it matters to Jesus, because we have an example here where he's really not too perturbed by the fact that his disciples, after the long walk and climbing a mountain, that he's perfectly fine, with them being there. And all of this takes place because Jesus is with his community. Recognize the disciples could have been left to sleep and miss the transfiguration. But they're not. They are jolted awake in faith. They are sort of moved by faith to wake up at that time, and they are experiencing it. Jesus wants them to experience it. And so Jesus brings this about, which I think is exactly what Jesus does with us when we're in prayer. We're never going to miss a message. We're never going to miss anything that Jesus wants us to know or to learn or to gain insight in or to feel or to express. We're never going to miss any of that, because Jesus is always going to make sure that we are awake at the right times to capture that, just like with the disciples, exactly in the very same way as with the disciples. Now, we have this situation where, Peter, I like to suggest that Peter woke up groggy. And because he woke up groggy, he wasn't really aware of what he was saying. However, the rest of the Gospels would all contradict that. Peter is really good at putting his foot in his mouth. And he is really good at talking way too fast. Peter is awakened, and in the awakening and in the transfiguration, he is excited, enthusiastic, and thinks that this is it. And so actually wants to somehow concretize this experience by building 3 tents. I want us to think about the three tents for a minute, because I think it's important. Not only were the tents indicative of the presence of the divine, but also let's realize that this is not a cool, comfortable experience. It's hot. And in the midst of all this heat, Peter is thinking, well, you would all stay longer if we built these tents, and you would stay, and this way you'd be comfortable, and then we could all be here. And so recognize, if you will, that Peter is very human, and in spite of the holiness and the glory that is shining and shining around them, whatever the word is, he is caught up with trying to hold on to the moment and to the experience, and then this cloud shows up. Now look, I don't think this is God in any way, shape, or form telling off Peter. Because if that was the case, we would have an entire gospel dedicated to all the times that God would have to tell off Peter for things that he has said, that just didn't make any sense. I think the key part of this is the following. The voice in the cloud says, for the first time in any of the Gospels, if you remember at the baptism, the word that is heard from the clouds is, "This is my beloved Son." There's a change here. This declaration is, "This is my chosen." This is my chosen. Meaning, this is my person. This is my ambassador. This is my representative. This is me in all of my presence infused into my Son. This is my chosen. And then recognize how the rest of the words go. It's not hear him, it's listen to him. I have been counseling for about 25 years now. Marriages, a lot of couples. There is clearly a difference in relationships between people who simply hear each other and then those who listen to each other. Listening is an active participation. Listening actually requires you not just to hear sound, like hearing does, but it requires you to actually process what is being said so that you are fully incorporating what is being talked about into your being. And I want to suggest that the very same thing is true in our relationship with Jesus. I think we have become very comfortable at hearing about Jesus. We've been doing this since we were children. We continue to struggle along the way. We wonder sometimes why things are difficult and challenging. We wonder why we feel alone and isolated. We wonder why there are all these barriers in our life. And I believe some of it is because we have become very attuned at hearing what Jesus has to say and hearing his direction, but we really don't listen to it or process it or make it part of our life. We hear it, and we hear it ad nauseum. And sometimes we hear it in environments and in situations that turn us off, and therefore the next time we go and we hear something like that, we shut it down as well. We are called as disciples, and this is clear from what is happening on this mountain. Notice Peter doesn't say a word after this. God the Father makes it clear. Listen to him. Incorporate what he is saying. Incorporate his teaching. Incorporate what it is that he is speaking about. Don't just hear it, but make it part of who you are. And that is a fundamental challenge, I think, for the season of Lent that works for us as well. Earlier, we talked about climbing the mountain. Are we making time? Are we struggling with our own mountains and our own obstacles to make time to be with Jesus? I'm not talking an hour of dedicated devotional reading. I'm not talking about rosaries. I'm not talking about any time. I'm simply asking, are we making quality time to be in the presence of Jesus? Because when we're in the presence of Jesus, even if we fall asleep, Jesus will make sure that we get all the good parts and that we understand and we're there and awake for those right times. And then I think the other part, the challenge for Lent, is for us as Christians, we need to stop hearing about Jesus and we need to listen to the Gospels one more time. And the easiest way to do that is the Gospel of Mark. Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark's gospel was what was read to those people who were becoming Christians. That was the gospel that was shared with them in its simplicity. It is easiest to read and to listen to the message to incorporate that. If we're wondering why our faith is weak, if we're wondering why we don't feel hope, if we're wondering why we don't feel loved or forgiven by God, if we're wondering why we're having a hard time reaching out and loving others, if we're questioning some of this, some of the own struggles in our own life and those barriers that keep us away from God and from one another, it's because we simply have not listened. We haven't listened. We've heard, but we're not listening. So what mountains will we have to climb this week? And when we do, let's make sure we find the time to listen.